Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Vinyl Tales, where we spin tales about vinyl. Now, I got a real interesting story for you today. The album that we're going to talk about today is one of the best-selling debut albums of all time. It went platinum not even 2 years after its release, and both the music and the cover picture are all instantly recognizable by music lovers everywhere. It's got a real good story that leads up to its initial release with some twists and turns that you wouldn't expect. Let's get into it with today's episode of Vinyl Tales. Released in August 25th, 1976, we have Boston's self-titled debut album today. When it was released, it very quickly broke all kinds of sales records and was named the best-selling debut LP in the US at the time and received an award from the RIAA for that achievement. Considered a staple of 1970s rock, it is included in many lists everywhere and is also almost every track is still included in the rotation for many classic rock radios, even today, almost 50 years later after its initial release. This album, as of 2003, has been rated 17 times platinum. Now, there's a step above platinum called diamond, which is 10 million sales. Platinum is 1 million, which means this album here is almost rated 2 times diamond, being at 17 times platinum, which is all rather impressive, but it's not the point. Did you know that this album was not actually recorded in a professional studio owned by a record label, but instead it was recorded in someone's basement? I didn't either, but the story is actually rather interesting. It's got all kinds of twists and turns that you just wouldn't expect for a music album. So, without further ado, let's get into the story. In 1969, a man by the name of Tom Scholz, who would later go on to be known as the guitarist for the band Boston, was going to MIT out in Massachusetts. And he decided that he was just going to start writing music. And so he started writing music while going to MIT. And while out there, still in college, he joined a band called Freehold. In Freehold, he would meet some of the future members of Boston. When he eventually graduated MIT with a master's degree, he went to work at Polaroid, the company that's well known for their cameras. And while working at Polaroid, what he did was he took his salary and he would use his salary to purchase studio recording equipment. And since he only lived in an apartment at the time, he didn't live in a house. It was the apartment's basement. But he used the salary from Polaroid to purchase studio and recording equipment and build himself his own personal recording studio in the basement of his apartment. And in 1973, he got some people together and he formed a band called Mother's Milk. Mother's Milk didn't last very long because a year later in 74 they disbanded. But it was during this time in 74 and early on in 75 they wrote and recorded 6 songs. These 6 songs would all later go on to be associated with the name Boston instead, because 5 of those 6 songs are right here. Now, another one that's actually on this album is the song Foreplay. That track that says foreplay slash long time. Well, Foreplay is actually an instrumental, and it's that instrumental, Foreplay, was one of the first songs that he wrote back in 1969 while attending MIT. Well, he had written these songs, and he had this band that wasn't really doing all that good. And so, using his recording studio and the fact that he played multiple instruments, he recorded these songs, and he would send out the demo tapes to different record labels. And that's where the story takes a real interesting turn. So, hold on to your hats and stay in your seats, because here we go for the real fun. Now, Tom Scholz and his wife in 1975 started sending out these demo tapes that they were making and putting together. And they'd send them out to just about every record label that they could find. Some notable ones are RCA, Capitol, Atlantic, Elektra, and Epic, which flat out rejected the tape altogether with a, quote, very insulting letter saying that basically they were crap. Now, on this demo tape were the songs More Than a Feeling, Peace of Mind, Rock and Roll Band, Something About You, San Francisco Day, which was later changed to the name Hitch a Ride, and the song called Love, which was later changed to the name Don't Be Afraid. Now, also in 1975, while mailing out these demo tapes, he still worked at Polaroid, you gotta remember. And so he took one of his demo tapes, handed it to a coworker at Polaroid, and he was supposed to have this coworker mail the tape out to somebody. Well, the coworker completely forgot about it, and it sat on his desk for months until Tom Scholz started getting phone calls asking about where it was at, and so it eventually did get mailed off. Well, after it got mailed off, this guy in the office that it got sent to, he was just working, doing his day, when one of his coworkers in the label office was listening to the demo tape. This guy walking by happened to hear it and thought it was pretty good. And so he had a deal with a record promoter that was based out of California, where if either one of the two guys ever heard something that was pretty good, they would inform the other of what they had just discovered. And so this guy at this random record label who just happened to stumble upon this demo tape called this record promoter out in California to tell him, hey, I've got this really good band here. Their music sounds pretty good. You should check up on them. Well, the record promoter out in California had an in with Epic Records. And so the promoter got a hold of Epic Records and said, hey, these guys are pretty good. You should check them out. And so Epic Records, led by the current head of the company, the record label, who, remember, had already flat out rejected this demo tape once already, thinking it was utter crap, got a hold of Tom Scholz, saying that I'm willing to offer you a record deal, But first, you got to play a showcase for me and some representatives from Columbia, because Columbia owned Epic. So that way, we can actually see for ourselves how good you are. Because they wanted to make sure that this so-called band wasn't just some mad genius fiddling around in his basement. And so, in November of 1975, Tom Scholz got his group for Mother's Milk back together, and they played in a warehouse out there in Massachusetts. Well, the warehouse that they played in for this showcase was actually one of the practicing places of another great band that you may know. This band is called Aerosmith. And so, Boston, at that point in time known as Mother's Milk, played their showcase in front of a bunch of representatives from Columbia in an Aerosmith practicing warehouse to show them, hey, yeah, we actually are as good as we sound on the tape. And so, a month later, making it December of 1975, Tom Scholz and Mother's Milk had a record deal. Now, the story gets so much weirder after this point, because this is where some deception goes on. Simply because Tom Scholz just doesn't like playing by other people's rules. So here we go into the fun stuff. Now, you see, Tom Scholz didn't like playing by other people's rules because after that band Mother's Milk got signed to Epic Records, he was told that they wanted him to go out to the West Coast to one of their studios and do a studio recording of all of these songs and make them sound exactly like they did in the demo tape. Partly because at the time the label had a deal with the engineers union, and what the deal was is any recording done within 250 miles of one of their studios, one of the union's engineers had to be present. Well, Tom Scholz, the guitarist of this band, didn't like not being in control of everything. And so instead of following Epic's rules, they were telling him, what he did was he got a hold of a friend. And this friend hooked him up with a guy named John Boylan. And he brought John Boylan in instead. Well, John's job was to, quote, run interference and keep them happy. He's basically the middleman between the band, led by Tom Scholz, and the label, because Tom Scholz wanted to do his own thing. And so Tom Scholz did his own thing. Remember, the label told him that they wanted a studio recording done in a professional studio that sounded identical to the demo tape. But Tom Scholz didn't want to play by the rules. So, what they got together and did was they put up a front. What they said was they were out on the West Coast in a professional studio recording the songs just like they had been told, because John Boylan was an engineer, so he was qualified to be there. And to help keep up the front, the lead singer, the lead vocalist of the group, stayed out there and actually recorded the vocals in one of the studios. Now, all the while that this is happening out on the West Coast, Tom Scholz actually goes back to Massachusetts. And it is during this time that they're putting up this front out on the West Coast. Tom Scholz is back in his basement recording studio in his house, or in his apartment. and he re-records all of the tracks, all the music on his cheap equipment that he has back there in his basement. And when he gets done, and he takes these re-recordings, this new demo tape, back to the label, he did such a good job that it sounded identical to the demo tapes that they originally heard. Now that that's all over, Epic goes ahead and releases the album. But the band was signed as Mother's Milk. Why is the album Boston? Well, because after Tom Scholz brought in John Boylan, because he didn't want to follow by Epic's rules, he wanted to do his own thing, he wanted to be in control. On top of the fact that he had grown so accustomed to working in his own recording studio and back home that he felt uncomfortable recording the music in a professional studio. And he didn't see the need for all that expensive equipment when he could do the same in his basement. Well, after he had brought in John Boylan, it was actually John Boylan himself, this guy who was brought in basically to run interference, who suggested that they change the band's name from Mother's Milk to Boston after they'd already been signed. That's why the group's called Boston, because some random guy brought in to run interference between the band and the label suggested it out of the blue. Now, that story's got some pretty crazy twists and turns, but I got a couple songs that got a little bit more to them that I also want to share with you. So hold on with me for just a little longer. I got some interesting pointers for you. Now you got to remember, all the while that this has happened, all this music stuff and labels and all the deception, Tom Scholz is still working at Polaroid. He didn't feel comfortable quitting Polaroid until he knew for sure that he was going to have a future in music. Because if the album was released and it did poorly, that way he still had a job to fall back on. But when the album came out, and it was an instant hit, it was an instant success, and here he heard it on the radio for the first time, he was so excited about the fact that he had a real future in music and that Boston was going to be a great success, that he struggled staying for another 2 weeks before he finally quit that Polaroid to do music full time. But there are a couple of songs on this album that got a little bit more backstory to them that I would also like to share. The first one is the song More Than a Feeling. More Than a Feeling is about a crush. What it is when Tom Scholz was 10 years old, apparently he had a crush on his older cousin, his older first cousin, as it is told. And so that's what More Than a Feeling is actually about. Now, apparently he ran into her later after the song came out, and his cousin was apparently pretty mad that he referred to her as his older cousin. I guess he didn't like being called old. And the other one is the song Peace of Mind. Now, Peace of Mind is actually about his superiors while he was working at Polaroid back in 1974. I guess he rather enjoyed working at Polaroid, and he got along well with his superiors, since the song's called Peace of Mind and not a horrible workplace. But Yeah, this whole album. Yeah, the music's pretty good. The cover's pretty interesting. And the songs are almost immediately identifiable by every music lover out there. But it was written in a basement. The music was recorded in the basement by a guy who graduated MIT with a master's degree and worked at Polaroid making cameras. Who would have ever thought that an album this great would have a backstory like that? Remember, this is Vinyl Tales, where we spin tales about vinyl. I'm Brandon, and if you got any more stories, any more cool facts about albums and songs individually, remember to put them down in the comments, and I will look into them. You never know. Something you suggest could be the next video. Have a good day. Stay tuned for the next episode. See y'all later.